Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to hear all about handling investigations regarding sexual harassment. It's great to see so many of you joining us today, and welcome back to those of you who've joined us on previous webinars. I'm Jo Lewis. I suppose it's important to let you know who I am. I am the MD of SafeCall, and I will introduce the panel shortly. But just before I do that, I wanted to just draw your attention to the right-hand side of the screen. There is a chat function there, and we'd really love for you to put any questions. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Please put them in the chat, and I'll either come to them as we go through, or we'll come to them at the end. And if we can't get to all of them, we will endeavour to come back to you and give you an answer to your question after the webinar. So earlier this summer, you may have joined a session that we had around talking about strategies around preventing and tackling sexual harassment in the workplace. We covered a range of topics around empowering employees to speak up in the first instance, and then also ensuring line managers, who often are the first point of call for people with regards to this sort of thing, are appropriately trained, and also the importance of investigating allegations of sexual harassment with precision and care. And today we're going to be taking a bit of a deeper dive into the investigation side of things. And there were a lot of questions last time around that. And I'm really delighted to be able to be joined by our three speakers today who've all got a wealth of experience in this area. So we've got Dennis Shotton, who's a former detective superintendent and magistrate, and now is a highly respected workplace investigator and does a lot of work with us at SafeCall. We've got Professor Gary Shaw, MBE, who's a nationally, I'm going to read this out to make sure I get it right, guys, a nationally recognised expert in investigative interviewing. So he's a former national advisor to the National Crime Agency and now a professor of investigative practice at the University of Sunderland, which is very close to us. And he received an MBE in the 2009 New Year's Honours List for services to policing, and also received an honorary doctorate for his work within the field of investigative interviewing, both nationally and internationally. So as much as everyone on the panel is incredibly well qualified around investigations, Gary's got a lot in terms of how to apply that experience. And last but by no means least, Sean McKillop. Sean is a trusted expert specifically in sexual harassment investigations and has a distinguished career previously in Police Scotland. And he also works really closely with us at SafeCall, advising us on sensitive workplace investigations. So welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm just going to move forward to the next slide. So in our last webinar, we were talking about this topic. As I said, it's a real topic of interest right now. As everyone's aware, there's legislation that's come into force last October, which means that employers, I'm sure, have always taken this very seriously, but there is legislation now to support that. And we're having lots of conversations with clients around strategies that they can put in place to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, we know that despite, whatever excellent measures you might have in place, it's impossible to fully prevent it happening. So on the last webinar, we asked viewers how many of them had dealt with a sexual harassment allegation in the last 12 months. And 45% said that they had. And several of the respondents said that they dealt with multiple allegations. And 18% had said that the number of allegations had risen within the last year as well. So, Sean, I'm interested to understand whether these numbers surprise you.
No, not at all. When you think, you've already covered it, Jo, about the introduction of the Employment Rights Act, the media coverage that is given to high-profile sexual harassment claims and claims of sexual abuse within the workplace, and sort of focusing back on the Me Too movement, it does sort of add to that sort of picture of individuals within the workplace feeling empowered to speak out when they feel that sexual harassment is occurring. So the increase in complaints shouldn't really surprise us, because there is far more awareness, and we should see it as a good thing. We should see it that our employees and people that we work with feel confident within the workplace to raise issues, knowing that they're going to be dealt with well. So no, it's not a great surprise to me at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, obviously, working for a whistleblowing organisation, we see any increases in reporting, regardless of the topic, to be a positive thing, because it means people have got that confidence and that they want to share, what's going on. And I think that, is really important. So just a quote here from Tim Smith, who heads up our workplace investigations practice internally. And I think, Tim says something, if you're managing people, that something like this will land on your desk. I mean, I think there's certainly a strong possibility of that happening if you're managing people over a period of time. So what we're going to do now is a quick poll to assess how ready as viewers you all feel if you did have something land on your desk, that how you would feel about investigating that. And don't worry if it's I haven't a clue, I really don't know. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about today. So the poll, as you can see, is how confident are you that your organisation has the necessary skills, knowledge and expertise to appropriately respond to allegations of sexual harassment. It's totally anonymous, so please do share. We'll give people a couple of minutes. So I think that's really interesting, and I am interested in hearing, some thoughts there. But from my perspective, and they're still coming in there, it's great to see that 4% of people are really confident, but the vast majority there are somewhat confident and possibly feel that there's areas for improvement, or not very confident at all. I mean, 80% not. So you've got 19, 20, 21. About 25% of people who perhaps feel not as confident. Interested, Dennis, in your views. Is that a surprise, or do you think that that's kind of quite normal for what you're hearing from clients?
To be honest, Joe, I think that's probably normal what I see. I think very confident, probably 4%, probably about right, really. I think there's somewhere in the middle there. It's because we are, and I don't know what the second part says. We are generally.
It says we're generally capable, but there are areas for improvement.
Yeah, and I could see that. And I think leading on from what Sean would say, and I know we're going to expand on this, but I do think when every report that comes in now, I think organisations will listen. But I think when it moves to the investigation part of it, we've got to look, whether it's anonymous or not, is organisations should manage that report seriously, manage and with sensitivity, but also quickly then conduct an investigation which is robust and thorough, which will then hopefully uncover somebody who has been found responsible for some sexual harassment. Now, for me, that's the starting point. But what it does as well from an organisational point of view, an effective investigation not only brings somebody forward who perhaps has done something clearly wrong, but it fosters a culture as well within the organisation of transparency, trust and accountability as well. And I know we're going to expand on that a little bit further.
Absolutely. So, yes, I mean, Sean, Gary and Dennis, you've got lots of experience in handling workplace investigations, as I mentioned earlier, covering a wide range of topics. And sexual harassment claims can be very emotive for the reporter, the accused, the investigator, and organisations really need to make sure that they get it right. And when we caught it prior to the webinar, you spoke about the importance of taking every report seriously, investigating each case thoroughly. So, Dennis, can you expand a little bit more on that, please?
Yeah, well, I just said there before, Joe, I think because you will get a lot of reports that perhaps are anonymous, but that does not mean we're not going to respond with the same as somebody comes forward as well. It might be that they're anonymous because they've reported it through a third party, so for example, SafeCall, or it might be that they've actually came forward but then want to remain anonymous. Now, what you're trying to do, if you can, is if that's the second scenario, is to try to get confidence and trust in that individual to move from anonymous to confidential. Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is to get the best evidence from that particular person So if then you're coming forward, so then they will share their experiences, and then if there's a misconduct hearing, or heaven forbid it goes further to a criminal matter, which I know we're going to discuss, you've got everything in place and you're supporting that person through the process.
Absolutely. And I mean, you make that point. So, Gary, I was going to come to you on this question that, you know, like other workplace investigations, like Dennis said, there will be times where a sexual harassment investigation allegation needs to be handed over to law enforcement. So can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
I think for me, and everybody said it about how important it is to treat this seriously. And I think if the person who, let's say it's not anonymous, and the person's making the allegation and wants to sit down and speak to somebody about it, it's really important that the person who is going to respond to the allegation sets the right environment in the first instance. So to be able to just sit down and so get, again, from that confidence bit, that person may have took a long time to bring up the confidence to come and speak to somebody. And it's really important about that first response when somebody sits down, even setting, you know, the environment. Is it the right environment to speak to somebody? Is it private? You know, and it might seem basic, this, but I think the basic what makes things work, but also the person who's asking the questions or responding to the allegations, that they decide to ask some questions, and they should, but it's how far to ask those questions depend on the nature of what's being said. So, you know, the person who takes the allegation, it would, if they have the time, it would be good to understand where the person's coming from in the organisation, because they might not have encountered them before, they might not have seen them before. So understanding them and where they come from helps towards an empathy. You know, if they've been in the company for a long time in the organisation, or they've only been there 2 minutes, it's really important to understand that. So again, the person feels the confidence of seeing what they need to be seeing, and then you can establish early on where you go next with it.
Great, thank you. And I can see loads of questions coming through in the chat, and we will try and respond to as many of them. We're going to come on to, there's a lot of questions about anonymity, which we'll come back to in a minute. But so what would your suggestion be then around that sort of identifying when it's the right moment to involve law enforcement?
I think it's understanding what the nature of the allegation is. Yeah, and if it's obvious that it's a criminal offence, then for me it's really important that the person who's taking the response understands how far they go. And really what they shouldn't be doing is starting to delve into it in any major way. Certainly getting an understanding of it, because they're going to have to hand it over to somebody else. So they've got to be really clear the types of questions they should be asking, and that comes through training and experience, doesn't it? What type? Because there's a big danger of a contamination happening very much at that point, where the wrong things, I've seen it before, where the wrong things said, or the, you know, in a clumsy way, which can affect the outcome for the future. And often, you know, being in the world of criminality for a long, long time, that initial encounter is crucial. So I think it's understanding what your policy is within the organisation as well. It's understanding the difference between, you know, a sexual harassment case and a criminal case. If you understand what I mean, whereby it's like an assault case, you know, where it becomes more of a sexual assault side of it. So it's the understanding, and I think people who are going to be dealing with these situations need to understand the difference.
Thank you very much.
Joe, can I just
to
echo that, Joe, just a bit, Joe, because I've dealt with this quite often as well, not necessarily with sexual harassment, but with a lot of workplace investigations where that line gets stepped over. And I know organisations are trying their hardest to do an investigation, and bear in mind we're looking at the balance of probabilities not beyond reasonable doubt when we come to a criminal matter, is if you step too far and you continue, it's just what Gary said, is that's when it's prejudicial. It's prejudicial to the respondent, and the case then could start to sort of have massive implications. For me, there's a level where you might do enough investigation where you're satisfied that it's serious enough, you're going to hand it to the police, and then you might be looking from an organisational point of view to suspend that person, or at that point.
Thanks, Dennis. There's a couple of questions that I think are probably worth addressing now. One is that, Gary, somebody's asked, can you give an example of what contamination might be?
Well, let's say you ask a question, right? And the person only gives you a little response, but you then put your interpretation upon it. So somebody might say, "Oh, it happened yesterday, like afternoon," and then you take that meaning afternoon to be a bit earlier in the day. Things like that, or you suggest things, like you make your suggestible questions, like, "Oh, that that you didn't want that to happen, did you?" Things like this, where your questions should be more just to gather that information, with you not putting an opinion in anything as well, because you can and also it's a really difficult one in that first instance where you're trying to show that empathy and understanding, but you've got to be really careful that you don't contaminate it, and that's what I mean by contaminating with your questioning style. If you start putting the person into a corner and they think they've got that answer stuff that they don't really sure about, and then that gets examined in the future and it turns out not to be as correct as it could have been, then people start alleging, "Well, hang on a minute, it's just been made up, you're changing your account," and that can simply become through from a contamination of how you ask the questions.
I think that's really interesting, because what we talked about on the last webinar, which we're not going to go into much detail around today, but is the importance of making sure that people have got the right level of training if they're having these conversations.
Absolutely.
And a lot of the time with with workplace investigations, that lots of organizations don't have investigators that are doing that as their full-time job. So I guess it's then thinking about who is going to handle that investigation internally.
I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial, Joe, and I think also, just to might talk about this later, but the importance of keeping an accurate record of when the person comes to see you, or even if the person's made a telephone call to you to arrange an appointment, keeping the details of what's been said in there, what time it was said, and even when the person comes to sit down with you, if whatever the right place, taking notes of the person's demeanor and how it's, because it can all become, when it's examined in the future, these are the types of questions that people ask, and sometimes things aren't recorded correctly at the beginning, or even observations aren't made, which they should be. I'm not talking about whether you think it's true or not that thing, not going down that path, but about treating it properly and investigating it, so somebody who's going to look at it later in whatever format gets a good picture.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions before we just move on to the next slide, but Sean, I think this would be quite interesting. So Julie's asked, can you advise how HR should proceed when they're the second party to hear of the accusation after the police?
So you would always be guided, if there is a police investigation ongoing, you would always be guided by the police investigation. HR come in terms of what action needs to be taken by the organisation, given the information that they have. There was a couple of things that I wanted to pick up with what Gary was saying as well. It is really difficult when you have a survivor of sexual harassment who reports what has happened to them. At the time that they're reporting, you're probably going to be the first person that they've spoken to, or and they will be nervous, they will be upset, they might not be thinking straight. So a lot of the information you get might be a bit confused. So you need to give them time and space. Also, try and keep a survivor focus to your investigation. Listen to what the survivor wants. Now, in the UK, it's up to the survivor if they want to make a complaint to the police. We may choose to do that to protect them and to protect other people if we feel that is necessary. However, if it's an individual complaint, the survivor, the person who that's happened to, has the ultimate decision as to whether they want to report that to the police or not, if they want to come forward. However, if you're working overseas and you have offices overseas, there are many countries where it is mandatory to report to the police if you become aware of something like a sexual harassment or a sexual assault within the workplace. So try and understand what local legislation tells you. Try and understand what your obligations are as an organisation within that country, so that you can protect both the individual and your organisation going forward.
Thank you, Sean. I knew there'd be lots of interest in this particular topic around when to report to the police. And I think what you're saying there, if I heard it right, was that it's really for the complainant to do that, unless you think there's a duty of care, perhaps.
Yeah.
But Robert asks, is it clear where the line is if all harassment is criminal? Is all harassment criminal? I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. Anyone?
Sorry.
If you don't know,
I'll come in, Joe. No, the answer's no, but there's a level, I suppose, of a sort of a continuum where you'll get to a point where it perhaps could. It's probably not as definitive as that. I don't know if others want to add on. I don't think it's as definitive.
Yeah.
There'll be a
if I can come in on that, in my experience, you will, and like Dennis and Gary, I've been doing this for a number of years, but every incident is different, and every set of circumstances is different. And I still get incidents that I'm looking at, and I'll sit and I'll go, I'm not sure whether this is over the threshold or under the threshold or what it actually is. And that's the point where you look for legal advice. So don't just make that assumption.
Yeah.
Sit down, look at what you've got, discuss that with somebody that can give you some legal advice in terms of, is it over the threshold, is it not, and proceed on that basis. So if you're not sure, seek advice about it. Don't just make an assumption. So that's what I would tend to do, is if I wasn't sure, then talk it over with somebody that understands the legal process within the country that you're working, and just see what their advice is.
I think it's spot on, Sean, and I think it's about asking enough questions to get the detail so that you can make sense of what the allegation is of what's happened. Because, and again, depending on if it's your and not be a full-time role, but if it's your full-time role to be the person who investigates, understanding legislation yourself and preparing beforehand, because that gives you a feeling of what types of questions you should be asking, or what areas you should be asking in, but not in a clumsy way. It's just trying to, people often go to, like police officers go to scenarios and they don't know what they're going into either, and they're not really sure what the offence is either. But by gathering all of the information in the correct way, then they can make sense of it. Sometimes it starts off at one thing that becomes something later by the time things come through. So it's a really tricky one, but I think it's important. This thing with investigating with integrity that's on the slide, it's really important just to gather it. Gather what I would call the investigative material that you're trying to get, and it may be, as you proceed, what you get from that point will help you direct the investigation.
I think it highlights. I think it highlights as well, Joe, what Gary and Sean are saying, is that in most organisations there isn't a trained investigator. It tends to be a manager who is asked to do investigations on top of the day job. And I just think it highlights, especially in particular when we talk about sexual harassment, how difficult and a tall order that is to ask somebody to do that without proper training.
Agree, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of how to approach this when something comes to you now. There's been a couple of requests, if you can, to give examples and for people of, like, you know, different scenarios that would help them with trying to frame this. And as well, which I think something we're going to come on to now, any hints and tips for coaching first-time investigating officers would be helpful, because what this person has said is that in many cases, and this is, I think, you know, very understandable if you haven't been trained, there's a lot of emotional attachment and bias towards the complainant. And it's, I guess, how does it then, you know, coming back to what you were saying earlier, how do you make sure it's impartial and it's a fair sort of process? So if we think about the investigation process, then it starts with somebody making a report, obviously. And last time we talked about the importance of having clear and accessible channels to do that, and having a choice of different channels, you know, whether that's anonymously online, whether that's your line manager, whether that's calling into a hotline or whatever it might be. But mostly, and the research shows this, the most common place that people will go is to their line manager. And as we discussed, and as we have discussed, these people are often not appropriately trained to handle that. So the initial response, as we've said, whether it's the line manager, HR, whoever, is really crucial. So we've kind of touched on this, but I think it's a question we've been asked quite a lot. So what does the initial report recipient need to do? And I'm going to come back to Dennis on this one.
Joe, say it again. What's the initial report?
What does the initial report recipient, what do they need to do when somebody comes to their desk or whatever it might be? Like, what, you know, what's the process really that they should be following? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think straight away you can be thinking about where you're going to get. And again, you've touched on there. It's not about believing or not believing that individual. You are there to offer sensitivity and empathy towards that individual. So straight away. So if I'm looking at the disclosure at first, I'm straight away looking at, am I going to be able to corroborate some of this evidence? It can be difficult. Is it potentially historic? So I'm going to be looking straight away at where I'm going to be able to look for evidence to see if I can prove or disprove this particular allegation. So that's the first thing I would be looking at, and that's before even if I've been just given a written disclosure. Is that what you're after there, Joe, or is it in person?
Yeah, just the process that they would follow.
So once then that person would then, if I then met with that person, would do what we said before. You're going to be listening, you're going to be taking time, exactly what Sean and Gary were saying before, as we then go through to gather as much fine-grained detail as you possibly can, because you might, when you're interviewing somebody, whether it's face-to-face, and to be honest, nowadays, you might not even have the opportunity sometimes, or the individual might not want to be interviewed face-to-face. They might want to be interviewed remotely because that might make them feel more comfortable. You then might have to have multiple interviews to get that picture, because you want to get as much fine-grained detail as you possibly can before you then start speaking to other witnesses. Now, what you're trying to do as well is that individual might give you more individuals that perhaps might be subject of sexual harassment as well. You've got to be proactive as well. You're going to be proactive and try to get as much evidence as you can to get as much material, because a lot of it might not be written, there might not be texts, there might not be CCTV. So you're looking to get as much corroboration as you possibly can for potential other witnesses as well.
And could I just add something to that, Joe, as well? Just for, because what you've said, and it said before, how people might go to the line manager in most instances. Now, maybe that the line manager in the organisation isn't the one who's going to investigate the inquiry, right? So it's really important that if you're a line manager, somebody comes to you. Everything what Dennis has said about listening to it properly, but as I said before, about taking some notes and keeping it right, because you might be handing that over to somebody else. So, and you might, the line manager might, you never know, become a witness in the chain of events. So, and it may be, let's say you are the person who's going to be investigating, it may be a two-stage process, in as much as you might get that initial account from somebody. There might be a lot of emotion in there. It might not be the right time to go into any more detail, or the person might not want to do that. So it's making sure that when you end that session, you know the person leaves with the expectations of with the right expectations of what's going to happen next. So it's just, there's that many different, I suppose, permutations that could come into it. But I think what we're saying is treat everything, seriously that's been said here. But you've got a duty, haven't you, to everybody involved, including the person in the future who's going to be subject of the allegation, that you get it right from the outset.
Thank you, guys.
If I can come in on
yeah, sure.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that, Joe. I know that we're here to talk about investigation, but as Gary and Dennis have pointed out, the initial contact with a complainant is really, really important. And that will probably be a line manager who may not have investigative experience, who may not have dealt with anything like this before. And it's a really difficult position to be in. So the advice that I always give is listen, work on the premise that there should be no surprises for the survivor of the harassment. So when you are talking to them, try and tell them what's going, as Gary has said, what's going to happen next. So if you're the line manager and you know you're not going to investigate this, this is about listening to them, giving them confidence to speak. As Dennis and Gary have said, gathering as much information as you can without asking too many questions. Let them talk to you, and be clear that you need to share this information with someone, because you're not going to be the one that investigates. You're going to have to hand it on to somebody, and you can't carry that burden of investigating this whole incident by yourself anyway. So it's about being open and clear with that individual right from the start. And like we say, investigating with integrity. It is about making sure that that individual understands there will be other people involved in this process. There may be somebody that will come and speak to you and gather more information. So as the line manager, it's important that you are calm, you listen, and you give clear information back to that individual.
I think that route map, what you've just said there, Sean, is essential, because if I'm being interviewed or anybody's been interviewed, the one, with just so serious and so emotive, you want to know what's happening. You've got to keep in touch. You've got to be in contact.
And it may be that, as the line manager, you're not sure what the person wants to come and speak to you about. So it may come out the blue. You might think it's to do with something else, time off for holidays, but then suddenly it's something else, right?
Yes.
So the issue for me is exactly as Sean says, get that detail. Now, when Dennis is talking about fine-grained detail, that might come later. That might come later, because taking that initial account is different from sitting down and doing a structured interview with a person later. Now, but as the line manager, it might not be you, but whoever it is, there's got to be some planning put together to create the right environment for that person for you to speak to them on the next occasion. So having that, the person having the trust in you, first of all, to come to you, but then having the trust with you because you've told them what's going to happen next is the right thing, which is going to happen next. And it does happen next. And it builds that, engenders that confidence in the workplace for everybody, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're really great points. And there's some really interesting questions coming through on the chat, which I'm trying to keep up with. And there's some similar topics. I'm going to paraphrase the questions that I'm seeing. But one of the key questions that people seem to be asking is, I guess how they progress from a workplace perspective when the police have become involved, because obviously police investigations into this sort of thing can take a lot of time. So, you know, and if people seem to think, you know, some people seem to be saying that they would still follow their internal processes. So if they've then followed their internal processes, they've done their internal investigation, are they able to then dismiss that person, or, you know, do they have to wait for that police investigation? I guess it's a bit of a tricky one.
Joe, this has come up quite often now, where somebody has been accused of sexual misconduct. It's moved to the police are investigating it. The person's been suspended, but the person hasn't been charged. So they are then on police bail. And I've been asked a couple of times, should that person then be dismissed because they've been arrested? Well, that's a sort of tricky area, isn't it? When you're starting to look to dismiss somebody who hasn't been convicted. In normal circumstances, what would normally happen if it's a criminal matter, and something's, and I'm conscious of the way the criminal justice system is at the moment, that cases are taking a long time to get to finish, is you're probably most of the time going to have to wait to the conclusion of the criminal matter to then put a stay on your internal processes and then wait the outcome of that. And following that, you would have a discipline hearing or misconduct hearing following the conviction if that person is convicted. So it's a difficult area if you start looking to dismiss somebody just because they've been accused.
It's really helpful. I think that answers it. And would anyone like to add anything to that before I move on to the next question that I've got here? No, brilliant. So Julie's asked a really interesting question. So in their organisation, they record around 90% of their interviews because it can help them then focus on the question format and, you know, and sort of be really following the process that they want to follow. But she's asking, where do they stand with those recordings from a criminal investigation perspective? Because obviously it's very sensitive data.
For me, again, it's the nature of what is being investigated.
Yeah.
But and I would have said, you know, if it becomes like a criminal allegation, and the police want to listen to that initial account, then I would have thought, you know, that there would be a question of sharing that with the police, obviously with the permission of the person who's made that allegation in the first place, because I think it, you know, having been an advocate for a long time, I mean, of tape recording witness interviews, I think it's really, if you have that policy in place, it really assists everybody. You know, and I think, again, it's making sure that of anything after in form of written is supported by what's heard on the tape. And there's, you know, so that's you know, that's a common thing now, where a lot in serious cases where a lot of witnesses are interviewed on tape. So I think I've advocated since the mid-90s. So I think it's a good approach to adopt. It helps everybody.
What I would say, Joe, when it comes to workplace investigations, and working with a lot of employment lawyers, they're still, in most cases, and it's a continuum as well, but in a lot of workplace investigations, they still advocate taking notes, that you're sharing notes. So it's written notes and you share. Gary's right. I think as it moves towards more serious matters, that, especially what you touched on there, when we're talking about sexual harassment, which then could change over to something that's sexual abuse or a criminal matter. I think once we start looking at cases like that, we might decide to audio record. When you start audio recording, we've got, I think, be conscious of about what devices are we using?
Yeah.
Are we complying with GDRP? If it's going to be to transcribe, are we using AI to transcribe it, or we're using an outsourced to transcribe that? We have to be conscious of that data, that personal data.
Yeah.
Who else is getting to see it? And I think that's then when the organisation has to look carefully at its policies about IT and data retention.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm conscious of time because we've only got 6 minutes. And I'm going to ask one more very quick question around the topic, and then I want to talk about anonymity, because there've been loads of questions around anonymity.
Yes.
But so going back to the point, Dennis, that you made about having to wait potentially until after the criminal investigation before you make your decision around the workplace stuff. Sarah asks if there's enough evidence from the internal investigation to consider dismissal on grounds of, for example, breach of dignity at work, could the business not progress? And I guess we're not lawyers, I suppose, is the first thing to say. So you know, that's the caveat here. But what's in your experience, I suppose, Dennis?
Yes, coming back what Sean said, you would probably take legal advice at that point, because would a dignity in action breach in itself be seen as gross misconduct? And that's the part for me. Or would it seen as misconduct, but we're adding an extra layer on because we've got this criminal matter sitting in the background? I'm trying to be, would it be seen as fair? So I think that would be the because from an organizational point of view, you think, great, this person's gone. If there's a breach there, but would that, in a normal circumstances, make the threshold of somebody being dismissed, or would they just be given a written warning? So I think that's where you would need to have legal advice at that point.
Thanks, Dennis. So I just want to now, and I'll go to Sean on this, you know, there's lots of questions in the chat around the challenges where people wish to remain anonymous. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, you will get that a lot in terms of people coming forward initially anonymously. That does make your investigation more challenging, because if they are anonymous rather than confidential, so anonymous meaning you don't know who it is that is raising this complaint. You don't know the name of the individual, so therefore your ability to speak to that individual is restricted because you don't know who they are. That means that you've got to look at what they're presenting and look for investigative opportunities within what they have presented to you. So when we talk about a thorough investigation, when you're talking about anonymous allegations, your investigation has to be very, very thorough, because you have got to go through every little piece of potential information that would either confirm or corroborate or not corroborate what's been alleged by that person who's reported anonymously. The other challenge that you have, well, the thing that you need to work on when you're dealing with an anonymous complaint is to try and build confidence within your investigation and be open and transparent about your investigation, so that the person who has made the complaint will see that there is an open, transparent investigation going on that is being dealt with professionally, and hopefully will give them the confidence to step forward and then remove that anonymity. So that's when it's really important that your investigation is done with integrity, that you've everything that Gary and Dennis have talked about in terms of you've planned it well, you're gathering all the information, you're bringing in all of those minute pieces of information to build up a case, or to actually say, well, there's no case here at all, either or. But you're open about that, and you are letting people see how that is being done. But it doesn't mean you can't progress with the case, but it does mean that you have to work very hard in your investigation to understand whether there is evidence to support that or not.
Thank you, Sean. So there's loads more questions, and what I was going to say is we're due to finish in 2 minutes. We will stay on and answer a few more questions, but understand that people may have to drop off for other meetings, and we will, I know there's people being asked about some kind of written document. We will share some stuff afterwards. But Chris says the investigator is important. With that in mind, what is it? And this is, I'm good at Dennis, because Dennis does a lot of our investigative training for clients at SafePaul. What is a good level of training for an investigator to be able to upskill a body of internal managers to lead investigations in general? Experience is one which is only gained through doing cases, but what training and level of training should you provide?
Right. Well, for one, I think it's a tall order to ask anybody to be an investigator without any kind of training at all. I think that is self. And as I touched on earlier before, I would say in about 80%, when I run my investigation courses, I would say 80% of managers that come on it tends to be they've had little training. I'm putting HR separate. HR have a lot of training, but a lot of managers who are appointed as an investigator, it is added onto their day job. And to be honest, even if they've got the best enthusiasm in the world and they really want to do it, let's be honest, it's a very specialised area. And to be honest, they haven't got the time as well. So sometimes where it works is it works really well because they're supported by HR. So I think at least you should be, if you are appointed as an investigator, you should have at least some level of training. Now, obviously, I run a course of training, and I do online for about 2.5 hours, or do a full day's training. Now, is that sufficient? Well, at least it's a start, and it's a start. And I think the more complex cases that you would be involved with, the more intense training you would need. But for me, it's from an organizational point of view. If I was somebody subject to an investigation and I was being investigated and the person had no investigative experience at all, I wouldn't have any confidence if I was the person raising the complaint, and I wouldn't have any confidence of the person if there was a responder as well. And I think if you looked at it impartially, looking at that, it's not right. That's not right.
Thank you, Dennis. I just wanted to address the last question. Well, first of all, for those of you who have left, and sorry, still here, I know some people have left, I just want to do one final quick poll, and then we're going to address the multi-country jurisdictions question, and then we might have to finish and follow up afterwards. So please, could you let us know where you see the gaps in your organisation's ability to investigate these allegations? And obviously, we've just talked about sort of the line manager piece there with Dennis.
Yeah.
And that means that's an unsurprising outcome from my perspective, because I've done a number of these, not just sexual harassment based investigations, you know, any workplace investigations. And it tends to be the sort of the line manager cohort that, you know, that, as Dennis said, it's not the day job and it's a lot to expect. So I think that level of you know, some level of training, whether that's, you know, internally, whether you've got sort of trained investigators who then train the line managers, or whether you do bring in somebody from an external organization to do that, I think that's obviously very important. And the lack of specialist knowledge, clearly, I would say is you know, given the topic that we're discussing, makes a lot of sense with all of the things that we've talked about. So I'm not going to go into any more kind of conversation about that, because I'm very conscious that we're over now. But Sean, I did just want to come back to you on that last point around, we talked briefly about there being different laws in different countries. So how should an organisation look at how they would deal with it if something was spanning multiple countries?
Yeah, so really important that you understand where your employees are contracted to. So if you're a multinational organization, your staff will be either contracted to UK contracts, or they may be contracted to local contracts. If they are locally contracted staff, then you are governed by local law, local employment law, when you are dealing with those individuals. So what you need to do when you are dealing with these cases is, at a very, very early stage, is consult with local legal advisors to understand what the implications are for your investigation. Now, I've done investigations in a number of different countries and jurisdictions, and sometimes you've got a very tight time scale from the point that you become aware of an incident to the point where you have to submit a report. You've got very strict guidance around about when you can suspend an individual based on the evidence that you have, and how long that individual can remain suspended, and what information they are given at the point of suspension. So really, really important that you understand what your obligations are within the country that you are operating when you start that investigation, so that your investigator knows what they have to do and when they have to do it. So that focuses in on the person who is alleged to have committed the sexual harassment. And it may be that you've got staff contracted in other places that have been sort of the witnesses to that. So it's explaining it all and understanding the implications for your investigation. So take legal advice early, and when you're developing policies, consider how that policy will land in that particular country based on their local employment laws. So take advice regarding the implementation of your policy within that country should you have a complaint.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks to all of you. I could listen to you all day, and there's loads more questions that we could answer, but we don't have time for them. On the training point, without putting a huge plug-in around SafeCall, we do offer quite a lot of different options for investigative training. So if that's something, there's more comments in the chat around, you know, training that works and training that doesn't. Do get in touch with us, because it may be something that we can help or give you a little bit of guidance on how to approach that for your organization. We will also, I think that there's a lot of specific questions and topics that have come up that I think we possibly will do a follow-up session in the coming months. If you joined our last session, we had a really experienced employment lawyer on that, so we may do a bit of a combination, because I think there's some quite specific questions that could warrant a bit more of an in-depth look at. So thank you for joining. Thanks for sticking with us past the end time. I've really enjoyed the session. I hope that you've all found that interesting, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick.